Today on Uncommon Knowledge, victory in the war on terror, or a neocon job?
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, do neoconservatives know how to win the war on terror? A great deal has been made of the influence within the Bush administration of neoconservatives, those who tend to take a hard line in the war on terror and who favored the war in Iraq. Recently, two men close to the administration wrote a book laying out the neoconservative agenda for winning the war on terror and making America safe. Their agenda is bold and ambitious. Critics would say it is reckless and dangerous. Who's right? Joining us today, two guests. Ken Jowett is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. David Frum is a former speechwriter to President George W. Bush and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Frum is the author, with Richard Perle, of the book in question, An End to Evil: How to Win the War on Terror. Michiko Kakutani of the New York Times, reviewing the book in question. David Frum, co-author Richard Perle, An End to Evil. Quote, the authors purvey a worldview of us versus them, all or nothing, either or. To quote their willful, flame-throwing language, there is no middle way for Americans. This is a quotation from David's book. There is no middle way for Americans. It is either victory or Holocaust. Close quote. Victory or Holocaust. Is that the premise about the war on terror that you hope the president and his advisors have or will adopt?
If they do, it would probably be the most significant mistake since 9/11.
Nice to start with a clear difference. David, care to explain yourself?
I think that is the way the president thinks. It's a hard choice. I'm sorry it offended the New York Times, but soft minds dislike hard choices.
You don't let up, do you? All right, Iraq. We overthrew the Taliban government of Afghanistan, which is harboring and providing direct support to al-Qaeda. We then continue to overthrow the government of Iraq. Now, many months later, we still have more than 150,000 troops on the ground in Iraq. We're committed to spending at least $87 billion to rebuild the country. Once again, last time, so don't worry, but once again, Michiko Kakutani, neither the failure to find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that might have posed an imminent threat to America, nor the failure to establish a connection between Saddam Hussein and 9/11 seems to have given the authors, David Frum and Richard Perle, pause. Why not?
Because those were only two of the entries on a long list of reasons why we believe that Iraq was necessary. There are only two of the reasons that the president cited. In my view, I'm not even sure they would be the two most important, although they were the two most urgent. The real argument over the war on terror is this: is the war on terror kind of glorified manhunt? Is the problem that you have these bandits who came out of the al-Qaeda trading camps and they've scattered over the planet, we now have to hunt them down and then either try them in an American court, or some of the Democrats want to try them before a UN tribunal? Or is this a major ideological conflict where terrorism comes out of a terror ideology connected to terrorist states? Is it a big problem that emanates from the crisis of the Middle East? And if you think that way, and that is the way that the hardliners think, it's the way the president thinks, I think it's the right way to think, that's the way we argue in the book, then you have a series of problems about where do we start. And one of the reasons that Iraq was so important, and one of the debating points you often hear from people who oppose the war, is that why do we do Iraq when 15 of the 19 hijackers come from Saudi Arabia? Excellent question, but there's an answer. And the answer is, why has the United States been so soft with Saudi Arabia for so long? And it was because Saudi Arabia had a gun to the head of the United States and the world. You liberate Iraq, you bring Iraq...
A gun to the head in terms of oil.
In the oil weapon. You bring Iraq back into the world market, and you've knocked the gun out of the Saudi hand. And suddenly the United States can now talk to Saudi Arabia, and that is happening at this moment in a whole new tone of voice.
There is a great deal else to discuss if you happen to agree with him on this point, but I want to establish it. Was going into Iraq when we did and as we did and on the grounds that we did correct?
Yes. we should have gone into Iraq, and Bush and Cheney and Rumsfeld and people like Mr. Frum and Perle and so on, they were right in that instance. They never came up with a clear rationale, and there is a clear rationale. Iraq was not a clear and present danger. It did not have weapons of mass destruction, but it was a clear and persistent danger. So I would like to contribute that to my colleague's argument.
Can I ask, by the way, you're very kind to the president, and even though your rationale is not exactly his rationale, you're kind to the president. Doesn't he deserve at least one or two demerits for providing a rationale that relies so heavily on imminence of weapons of mass destruction?
It was absolutely incorrect, if you forgive me for interrupting.
No.
Incorrect and playing to American public opinion. The idea was we elite know what the correct decision is to make, but the American population will not accept it. Therefore, we have to say there are little trucks running around with biological weapons. There are no biological weapons. They'll find no weapons of mass destruction, and we were yet correct to go into Iraq. Unlike
both our guests agree that going to war in Iraq was correct. But what should we be doing in Iraq now?
From a speech to the American Enterprise Institute, February 26, 2003, George W. Bush.
Right.
We will remain in Iraq as long as necessary. America has made and kept this kind of commitment before in the peace that followed a world war, Second World War he's talking about here. After defeating enemies, we left constitutions and parliaments. We established an atmosphere of safety in which responsible, reform-minded local leaders could build lasting institutions of freedom. Is that not setting the bar a tad high?
It's not, but listen carefully to what he says.
All right.
Listen carefully to what he doesn't say. He's not promising that those things will necessarily happen. He's saying that the United States will do its best to make sure that they do, and he always talks about not we are going to bring not that we will bring democracy to Iraq, but that we will bring an opportunity for democracy in Iraq. And if you actually read what exactly is said, you will find it's appropriately modest. But I'll tell you that even now, we are so far ahead of the game because we are seeing the resumption of electrical production in Iraq, the resumption of the flow of water through the irrigation canals. We're seeing the oil coming back online. We are seeing the emergence of critical voices all through the Arab world who are able to talk about what happened to Saddam Hussein. And we are seeing an increasingly powerful squeeze on the Saudi monarchy, which is in many ways the source of our problems in the region.
Has he set the bar too high for Iraq?
Yeah.
Raised expectations too high?
Yeah. It's very funny. When you look at Bush, he starts out with a global democratic revolution. Those are his words. It's rubbish. The fact of the matter is, in a country where 60% of the people marry their first cousins, if you can have a democracy, give me a break. Give me a break. The fact of the matter is, this administration, it is a tribal kin-oriented society, and all the people, Wolfowitz, Mr. Frum, Mr. Perle, all the rest of them, are invincibly ignorant about anthropology. They don't have a clue. Everything in the world is going to become Indiana. Iraq is going to become Indiana. This is a joke. The fact of the matter is, what we want are weak, authoritarian, corrupt dictatorships that will not aggrandize themselves territorially or go for weapons of mass destruction.
Weak, corrupt, authoritarian regimes may be what the professor wants.
I do.
But it's not what the president wants.
No, but you're saying that's the best we can hope for.
No, he said,
it's a question of realism.
No, it's what I want because that's what's realizable.
And what he seems to have forgotten is it was precisely out of such a regime that the 9/11 terror attacks came. And this is you're describing Pakistan, you're describing Saudi Arabia, you're describing all of our problems. One of the things you do is you take, and this happens a lot with some of the war opponents and some of the critics of the president. You don't listen to what he says. You take a cartoon version of what he says, and then you criticize it. You say, how absurd of the president to use the phrase global democratic revolution.
Yeah,
he used it. Absurd, used it in. I remember I was there, and I remember how he used it. He used it to describe what has happened in the world since 1989. And if you can deny the reality of that, you're just missing this colossal fact of the event.
On to fundamental questions of defining the war on terror.
An end to evil. You write. I'm quoting you, David. You and Richard Perle. Quote. You're talking about the president's critics. They are eager to arrest the misfits and thugs who plant bombs and carry guns. But as for the larger networks that recruit the misfits and thugs, as for the wealthy donors who pay the terrorists' bills, as for the governments that give terrorists aid and sanctuary, as for the larger culture of incitement and hatred that justifies and supports terror, all of that they wish to leave alone, close quote. From misfits to wealthy donors to governments to the larger culture. Do you wish to wage a war on terrorism or turn upside down the entire 1 billion plus strong Muslim world?
Well, those upside down is not the description is not the direction.
You feel entirely free to adjust my question before
I would say, I think in a way, you very well in this show have given a sense of what the debate is. I mean, Professor Jalla says, look, what we want to do is have a lot more regimes like the regimes that produced the 9/11 terrorists. These policies have been tried, and they've got a very fair airing over the past 30 or 40 years, and we have seen their result in the blood and slaughter and grief in New York City. What we, I think, need to take on board is this, that when you take in a planet with television sets and global communications, and when you have a lot of people living in societies that do not work, that do not create jobs, also in societies, by the way, where the local culture requires that if you don't have a job, you can't get married, and if you can't get married, you can't have girls. So you got a lot of jumpy 20-year-old men. That in such a place, you are going to have huge security problems. And in your interest of calming, all you want to do, if your ambition is as modest as calming the region down, then you have to say, well, what will it take? Well, it'll take more marriages. It'll take more jobs. It'll take some sense that people aren't being stolen from all the time. It'll take some sense that people have a voice in their own fate.
What I'm trying to get at is the question that I think a lot of people share, which is, just a moment here, the president and those close to him, and you and Richard are close to the administration, are simply taking on too much. And it sounds to me as though when I ask you, do you wish to reform the entire Muslim world, in a word, your answer is, yes, we do.
We'd like to give it a shot and a try, because if we don't, we have had.
Are they taking on too much?
We've had 40 years with the other way, which is to say, what we are going to do, we are going to find our security in cooperation with the secret police forces of the Middle East, and that has not worked.
Islam is a warlike religion, so I'm being more conservative than you. I have no problem with that. The idea that the world should be made up of Britain, Israel, and the United States is Bolshevik. Fewer but better. So is the notion in their book.
That's not what the actual Bolsheviks thought.
Actually,
we're talking a debate about Bolshevism.
We're talking about fewer but better. We're not talking about your policy.
The view they had in mind were not Israel, Britain, and the United States.
No, you're absolutely right. We're talking about style. You are completely
Bolshevik. By the way, do you grant that the president pussyfoots around the question of what Islam is like?
Wait a minute. Of course he does. Of course he does, and they don't want to say no because they want to influence his policy.
I think in a moment.
The fact of the matter is, Bush is purely wrong on the nature of Islam as a religion.
When people absorb liberal ideas, they find ways of coping with the things in their religious tradition that are dark and bloody and reinterpreting them. And that has happened in the past in Islam. 700 years ago, Muslim people were able to say, these passages of the Quran that seem so bloodthirsty, they don't really mean what they sound like they mean.
Or in the Torah, where Moses killed Jews three times.
That people find people through the process of human reason find ways of understanding their holy books in ways that are consistent with civilization. And that is what the president is trying to get at. And he also thinks if you're trying to change the world, you don't begin by damning and condemning a fifth of its population. They are people just like everybody else.
But you do attempt to reform them. Go ahead.
Look, the fact of the matter is we're dealing with an Arab Islamic world. If you go to Bangladesh, Indonesia, or India, you don't have really a problem. It's a minor problem. The fact is,
it's not incubating terrorists. That's
what you mean. For whatever reason, in Iran or Persia and in the Arab world, it has resulted in a thoroughly genocidal attitude that almost.
Now that we're discussing the Arab world, let's look at the place of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the war on terror.
I quote you, David. For hundreds of millions of Muslims around the world, or so the conventional view holds, the plight of the Palestinians has become the most vivid example of all examples of Muslim humiliation and defeat. By bringing a Palestinian state into being, the United States would calm passions in the Muslim world, strengthen friendly Arab governments, and prove itself a friend of Muslim aspirations. This thinking is completely wrong.
Yeah.
Explain yourself.
Because it overpromises. There's no doubt that a Palestinian state would be a very good thing for the Palestinians, and it might even be a helpful thing if it were the right kind of state for the Israelis, and it could be in some objective sense a good thing for the world, but it is not a big thing. That the idea that it is to this one problem that we can trace everything that has gone wrong in the whole Islamic world, including in between India and Pakistan, which are not harbingers of safety at all, but which are in fact very troubled parts of the world where there's a lot of terrorism, we have got a large problem, and this is a small piece of it.
Let me quote you again, David. The distinction between Islamic terrorism against Israel and Islamic terrorism against the United States cannot be sustained, close quote. William F. Buckley, Jr. There is a critical difference between the Taliban, or Bill might have said Al-Qaeda, and the Palestinian insurgents, which is that the Taliban has no case, zero case. The Palestinians do have a case, never mind how they assert it, close quote. That is to say, I put this to you, that the Palestinians have a specific historical grievance. Land that was for centuries Arab is no longer Arab and is now inside Israel. And that this distinction is one the United States has to bear in mind. Hamas and Hezbollah are animated by something quite different from what animates Al-Qaeda.
Yeah.
You don't buy that?
I don't buy that. I might buy it for some of the non-Islamic portions of the Palestinian movement. I think that in Hamas and Hezbollah you see the same messianic apocalyptic vision that you do see in Al-Qaeda. And I think you would find in Hezbollah's case in particular that Hezbollah does not stop at the borders of the area immediately around Israel. I mean, the author of, for example, the bombing in Buenos Aires, that was the largest foreign terrorist attack in the Western Hemisphere until 9/11. So they've got big plans, and they are interconnected with the Al-Qaeda movement, at least at the ideological level.
Your prescription is not to, well, the roadmap has hardly made any progress, but your prescription is not to stop working on the Palestinian-Israeli problem, but not to give that pride of place, not to permit the rest of the world to force the administration to take actions at all.
Not to have unrealistic expectations of what it would accomplish.
All right.
My own sense is that Hamas is horrible. Israel is on the margins of democracy.
Israel is on the margins of democracy?
Yes. It is truly a democracy
you have to explain
if you're Jewish.
Oh, I see.
If you look at 2/3 of the Arab-Israeli population, which makes up 20%, they've been dispossessed of their land. I want Israel as our ally. The point simply is that what Sharon wants is Hamas. Wants to get rid of Arafat. And so then you can have a truly ideological, murderous opponent, which Hamas is. I'd like to destroy it. I'd like to destroy Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah. But the fact of the matter is, Israel has to get rid of those settlements, allow for a Palestinian state like Costa Rica with a good fire department and no army. And Sharon will never accept it. And there's no evidence in his entire career that he will.
Let me ask you this.
Israel and
David,
Palestine are a key to the Middle East.
Ken, let me ask you something.
Next, how should the United States behave toward our European friends, if friends is the word?
David says, quote, acknowledge that a more closely integrated Europe is no longer an unqualified American interest and support the enlargement of the EU and NATO. Close quote there, but the notion there is the larger the EU and NATO become, the harder for France to dominate.
Exactly. That the more it becomes, the more of our friends are inside those boundaries, the more influence we'll have, and the less likely it will be to emerge as a rival superpower.
In Eastern Europe, we have friends.
We have friends.
Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, and so forth. Estonia.
Yeah.
You agree with him there?
Not at all. In fact, I think that the United States of America is a cultural mutant, one I love. It's based on individualism. And as Herbert Hoover said, that is more important than capitalism or anything else. It's the basis of it. If you look at Europe, at the current time, the United States of America is the dominant global power in human history.
Yes.
We are the cultural minority in human history. The only culture that supports ours is Western Europe. The point simply is we need Europe. Who defeated Germany and made it liberal capitalist democracy? We did. The same with Italy. The notion that we should just hang on to little England and hope they'll be nice to us. What we want to do is make NATO an equal partnership where the Europeans, and if France doesn't like it, good luck and goodbye, an equal partnership. We should be part of the EU. The last thing in the world we should do is ask England to leave Europe, Europe to leave us, and leave the only cultural area in the world that sympathizes with us.
After all these lectures about realities, I think one of the realities you have to take note of is the fact that Europe is changing, and that Europe had the disappearance of the Soviet Union, which was a big fact, fact that many people who think things don't change predicted would never happen, but it did, and the world's responded. And one of the things that has happened is that now the Europeans no longer need American protection, they respond differently. And this has created problems and dangers. And the United States needs a new policy. The American policy toward the European Union today is exactly the same policy as it was in 1957. And a lot has changed since 1957. Now, of course, Richard and I are passionate advocates of a North Atlantic community bound by common values. But it is reckless to disregard the fact that there are people in Europe who want to turn Europe into a state in opposition to the United States, and we need a policy to deal with that problem. And one of the things we recommend are aimed at hemming in this French project and by bringing in new allies into Europe precisely so that it will remain. Precisely so that it will remain part of a North Atlantic community.
My favorite sentence in the entire book, quote, "The UN is not an entirely useless organization." Close quote. Give us what you want to have happen to the UN.
Well, look, they do some good work in feeding people and bringing water in cases of emergencies, and the refugees agencies sometimes do some good work. But under the UN Charter was written for a world of dive bombers and tanks, and it recognizes the right of self-defense only in cases of aggression, that is, state action across an internationally recognized border. Well, that is not the security challenge the United States faces. There is no danger that Canada or Mexico will invade the United States. The danger to the United States comes from these kinds of secretive, covert groups, sometimes backed by states, sometimes not. And the UN Charter makes illegal almost everything, or purports to make illegal almost everything the United States needs to do to defend itself against these organizations. That charter has to change, and the United States should insist in the most forceful way that it do so.
Reasonable? Have I at last found an area of total and complete harmony?
Agree.
Last question. Can the United States really take on all that David is proposing? And if we can, should we?
I put to you a multiple choice question. Listen to a quotation. John Quincy Adams in 1821. The United States, quote, "goes not abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She is the well-wisher to freedom and to the freedom and independence of all. She is the champion and vindicator only of her own." Close quote. Here are your choices. Adams was wrong. That's A. B. He was enunciating a policy suited to the small country that the United States then was. C. Adams was enunciating a policy based on prudence and certain enduring aspects of the national character that suggests our aims in the war on terror should be limited. Ken? What's your answer?
American foreign policy should be based on excision, not conversion. And what...
Excision, cutting out the bad guys.
That's right. And what Mr. Frum and Mr. Perle, they reflect a missionary position, which is conservative in sex and radical in politics. They want to change the world. They want to make the world one of liberty. It's rubbish. It's utterly rubbish. It will not happen. And what we should
Rubbish
do...
because it's impractical?
No, because it's impossible. It's impossible. Where there are really democratic forces, we should support them. There are almost none in Iran. We should be engaged in doing what the president said. Where there is a clear and persistent danger, destroy them, but not delude ourselves that we're going to create democracy.
David?
When John Quincy Adams wrote that passage in 1826, the United States
21.
was 21. I'm sorry, thank you. I may be missing one, but the United States was, I think, the only democratic republic and one of the very few republics on the entire planet.
And he's commenting, of course, on Republican revolutions taking place in South America.
Right. 2 centuries later, we discover that we do live, as the president said, in an age of a global democratic revolution, and enormous numbers of countries and a very large portion of mankind live under exactly the benefits of the liberty and human rights that only Americans or few others had then. Now, I'm sure in the 1820s there are people who would say that for profound cultural reasons, these changes could only come to the United States, or maybe only to English-speaking countries. It was inconceivable they could ever settle in France, certainly in Germany. These were the havens of despotism, and yet they did. And yet they did. And today we face similar kinds of possibilities. The monster in that quotation came to the United States. I don't think it ever would have occurred to President Bush before 9/11. This is how he was going to be spending his presidency. But it landed here. And the question is, what is an intelligent and coherent solution to this problem? And one of the reasons I think one of the reasons that the people who advocate the kinds of policies that Richard and I advocate, one of the reasons we got a hearing from the president, not us personally, but people like us, is that when he went round the metaphorical cabinet table and said, we've been struck in this terrible way, does anybody have any ideas? He heard all kinds of people who said very similar things to what you said.
I doubt that.
And I'm sure,
wish I was there.
of course he did. And the question that I think he would have put to them was, what are you saying we should do that was different from what would have said a week ago?
Right.
And that policy failed. And we cannot be indifferent to the internal character of regimes from which these attacks on America come. The solution to this threat is bound up in the internal character of these regimes and not just in their external policies. That's why...
What about, how do you respond?
That's why Adams' words were right for then, but not right for now.
You've gotten the argument over and over and over again that you're just taking on too much.
I actually think we are taking on rather less than our parents and grandparents took on. That as daunting as this problem is, the problem of Islamic extremism and terrorism, I actually think it is a smaller problem than the problem of the Cold War, and certainly a smaller problem than in the days when the world's second mightiest industrial state was in the thrall of a totalitarian ideology, which it was determined to export by force. This is hard enough, but harder things have been done before, and that's why I'm optimistic that this can be solved.
Ken Jowett, David Frum, thank you very much. We're out of time. I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
I'm PBS.